It's one of the most sobering lessons in tech security, that sometimes the greatest threat to a company's data doesn't arrive in the form of a sophisticated foreign hack. Instead, it comes from its own infrastructure, exposed credentials, poorly guarded secrets, and a leadership decision to silence the alarm rather than sound it. In October 2016, Uber was breached. Not in a flashy way, no dramatic exploit, no zero-day worm. Two hackers gained access to Uber's private GitHub repository. There, they scoured source code until they found something critical: AWS credentials, keys granting access to Uber's cloud storage. These weren't just temporarily valuable keys. They unlocked Uber's S3 storage, containing archived backup files of sensitive rider and driver data. In short, with the GitHub keys, the hackers walked into the most private chambers of Uber's data vault. Using those AWS credentials, the attackers downloaded 16 distinct files. According to Uber's own disclosures and subsequent regulatory findings, those files included personally identifiable information. The Federal Trade Commission, in its decision, documented that the breach exposed approximately 25.6 million names and email addresses, 22.1 million mobile phone numbers, and about 607,000 drivers' license numbers belonging to Uber drivers. Nearly all that data came from Uber's archived backups, unencrypted, dating to before mid-2015. To get an idea of what was at stake, this wasn't a garden-variety dataset. For hundreds of thousands of drivers, their driver's license number, a deeply sensitive piece of identity, was out in the open. Soon after obtaining that data, the hackers made their demands. Emails began arriving at Uber's security office. According to court filings, the hackers claimed to have a major vulnerability and asked for a six-figure payout. Here is where the scandal deepened. Uber responded not by sounding the alarm but by paying. According to the FTC, Uber paid $100,000 to the hackers, disguised through its bug bounty program. But this was not a typical vulnerability disclosure, not a white-hat security researcher reaching out. These intruders had already taken data, and Uber insisted they sign non-disclosure agreements in which they falsely claimed they had not stored or retained any data. This payment, arranged by then Chief Security Officer Joe Sullivan, was controversial not just because of the amount, but because of how it was justified internally. According to federal prosecutors, Sullivan instructed his team to tightly control the narrative. He insisted publicly and within the company that they present the incident as if it were a standard bug bounty. Those internal documents, cited by the DOJ, show that Sullivan directed his staff to keep the full facts away from regulators and executives outside his team. In January 2017, Uber identified the hackers' real identities. Only then did they require them to re-sign the NDA, but this time under their real names. Despite this, Uber still did not disclose the breach publicly, nor to key regulators. For over a year, the truth lay dormant. Public awareness only emerged in November 2017, when Dara Khosrowshahi, Uber's new CEO, came forward. In his statement, he acknowledged the hack, the payment, and the fact that Uber had allowed the hackers to sign NDAs. "None of this should have happened," he said. "We will learn from our mistakes." But by then, the damage had begun to unravel. Several U.S. states filed legal action. In 2018, Uber agreed to pay $148 million in a multi-state settlement to resolve claims that it violated state breach notification laws by hiding the incident. Regulators and consumer advocacy groups were furious, not just about the breach, but about the decision to pay off attackers and pretend the incident was a bug bounty event. Meanwhile, internal investigations and regulatory scrutiny revealed more. The U.S. Department of Justice brought criminal charges against Joe Sullivan. Prosecutors said he actively prevented disclosure to the Federal Trade Commission, even though Uber was already under an FTC investigation from a previous incident. In October 2022, a jury convicted Sullivan of obstruction of justice and misprision of a felony, making him one of the first executives to be criminally liable for a breach cover-up. The court documents are particularly damning. According to the DOJ, when the hackers initially contacted Uber, they claimed to have dumped Uber's entire database, including the S3 backup containing driver license numbers. Sullivan's team then created an internal tracker to manage the incident, but that tracker also revealed that Uber had not rotated the compromised AWS key in years. The key was old, unrotated, and tightly trusted, a glaring security oversight. Uber proceeded anyway, eventually forcing them to sign the NDA under their real names, but only after identifying them internally. The criminal case also revealed that the NDA the hackers signed falsely stated that they had not taken or stored any data. But that was a lie. The hackers had indeed downloaded enormous amounts of data, including sensitive personal information. Sullivan and his team knew this. Internal communications show awareness that the data had been taken. According to the non-prosecution agreement Uber signed with the DOJ, Uber did not inform the FTC of the 2016 breach until November 2017, more than a year later. When the breach was eventually disclosed, Uber offered some mitigation to those affected. According to multiple news reports, the company provided credit monitoring and identity protection to some impacted drivers. But critics argued that this was a small gesture compared to the breach of trust itself, that the company had traded long-term reputation for immediate silence. On a technical level, this incident exposed fundamental flaws in how Uber managed its credentials. Embedding AWS keys in GitHub, failing to properly encrypt backups, and not rotating critical access keys had catastrophic consequences. Security experts pointed out at the time that storing secrets in code was one of the most basic errors possible, and Uber paid the price. Following the public disclosure and regulatory uproar, Uber underwent security reform. The company instituted stricter access controls, mandated multi-factor authentication for credential access, and improved key rotation processes. It also revamped its bug bounty program, clarifying that rewards should not be used to buy silence and reworking terms around researcher disclosures and NDAs. But the fallout wasn't just technical. Morally, it was devastating. For millions of Uber users, the news was a betrayal. For drivers whose license data was exposed, the risk of identity theft was real and deeply personal. Trust in Uber, once framed as a company that disrupted transportation, had been shaken at its core. The case also reshaped how the tech industry thinks about breach disclosure. Experts and regulators cited Uber's response as a cautionary tale. The lesson was not just how to prevent a breach, but how not to respond when one happens. Bug bounty programs, intended to improve security, can be misused if not governed by strong ethics and transparency. When Joe Sullivan was convicted, many saw it as a turning point. It underscored that executives can be held personally accountable. It sent a message that hiding data breaches, even under the guise of paying researchers, carries real legal risk. Today, Uber continues to operate at massive scale. But this chapter of its history remains a focal point whenever its security practices are questioned. The 2016 breach, and the decision to cover it up, exposed a dangerous reality. When companies choose to conceal rather than correct, the consequences ripple far beyond boardrooms. In the end, Uber's 2016 breach wasn't just a failure of technology. It was a failure of leadership, ethics, and accountability. That's the real story behind the hack. Not just what was taken, but how people acted to bury it.